to On My Way to Wealth, the podcast where busy Gen Xers can learn financial tips as they navigate life on their way to wealth. And now, please join your host, Luis Rosa.
Hello and welcome to another episode of On My Way to Wealth. This is episode 47. My name is Luis Rosa, and I'm your host. Today, we're going to talk about emergency savings, your emergency fund. Where should we put it? What is the best place for you to put your emergency savings? Now, before we get into where to put your emergency savings, let's talk about why have one in the first place. Well, it may seem obvious, but a lot of people that have debt, for example, have chosen to not have an emergency savings and instead reroute any extra dollar that they have towards paying that debt. And at first, it might make sense, right? From an interest rate standpoint, if you have credit cards that are high interest rate, a lot of people say, well, why should I have money in the bank just sitting there that is very low interest rate, right? So, it kind of makes sense. But I wanted to point out that the purpose of an emergency fund is for you to have quick access to it, to money that is typically in a safe place and that is easily available. Now, credit cards may fit that description because you can easily just charge on it. But what happens is if you find yourself in an emergency and you do not have funds to cover that emergency and you borrow on a credit card, well, you're kind of digging a deeper hole for yourself because now you're borrowing money and you're going to have to pay interest on that money, right? Whereas if you had emergency savings, you can easily just tap into that, cover the emergency, and go on about your day and eventually replenish it slowly, right? So ideally, you want to have, typically, financial planners like myself usually recommend anywhere between 3 to 6 months worth of expenses in emergency savings. If you can do more, some people feel more comfortable doing a year if they can, or at least build up to that. And the reason for that is because you just never know what might happen, right? I mean, sometimes this year, I feel like has shown a lot of people that a lot of things that we took for granted were not necessarily there, right? So a lot of us have been unemployed or maybe sent home on lesser pay. And it really has shined a light on the reason why we should have emergency savings. So let's get into it. So let's say you do have emergency savings. What is the best place to keep it? Well, some people like to keep cash in the house. I wouldn't advise that you do that, at least not a lot of money. Obviously, you want to have, a couple $100 just to have it easy accessible in your house. That's fine, but don't keep large sums of money in cash in your house for various reasons, right? One is somebody could break in and you can just lose all your money. So at least if you're going to do that, at least put it in the bank where you have some sort of safety, like the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC. So let's start with the bank. Most people look towards the bank to put their emergency savings. Now, there are several options at the bank, different types of accounts where you can place your money. One of them is your regular checking account. Now, the checking account, it's probably not the best because you're not going to get any interest on that money. Your traditional checking account doesn't really give you any interest. Some do, but it's very minimal. Now, the main concern for your money when it comes to having your emergency savings are two things. One is safety. So you want to have it in a place that is secure. The bank is one of them, right? Especially because if you have it under, say, $250,000, you're going to have FDIC insurance. Now, most people are probably not going to have such a large emergency savings. Number one is safety. Number two is liquidity. And all that means is how easy can you convert that money to cash and access it? So, for example, if you owned real estate, that is probably not that liquid because you have to either sell the property or refinance the property in order to access the cash that's trapped in that house, right? In terms of the equity. So when it comes to a bank account, liquidity just means, can I just go to the bank and get my money in this case? Can I access it via an ATM? Can I just make a quick transfer to another bank account, et cetera? So keep that in mind. Safety and liquidity are the number two things that you want to focus on for the placement of your emergency savings. Now, the third thing is that, yes, of course, you want to consider the rate of return, but you also don't want to go too far out chasing returns because then you're going to increase your risk. So let me give you an example of that. Let's say your checking account is not really paying much, so you look at an alternative, maybe a savings account. Traditionally, a bank is going to give you more of an interest rate in your savings account than they would on a checking account. So that could be a good option. Now, you might say, I have this emergency savings here. I really don't plan on touching it unless it's an actual emergency. So maybe I can place it somewhere else where I can make even more money than a savings account. And there are some vehicles where you could do that. One of them that you can look into is the high yield savings account. They've become pretty popular. A lot of online lenders out there who are still FDIC insured offer a high yield savings account where you would get more of a rate of return than you would on your traditional savings account at the bank. Now, those are still good because they are Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation insured and they are pretty liquid, right? You just have to make a quick transfer to your bank account. Some of them might give you access via a debit card or something like that, and then you have access to it. So that is important, right? Still having that safety, that liquidity, and then getting a higher rate of return. Now, because of the current interest rate environment, interest rates have gone pretty low, where your traditional quote unquote high yield savings account is really no longer giving you that much of an attractive interest rate. Yes, better than your checking or your regular savings, but not really that much more, right? So a lot of people wonder, I get this question all the time, like, is it even worth having money in a high yield savings account because the rate of return isn't as often? And some people want to explore even other options. So let's look at some of those. Let's say you want to get a higher interest rate than a high yield savings account. Another thing that you can look at is a money market account. And you can get one of these at your bank as well. Now, a money market account is kind of like a hybrid between a checking and a savings, where typically you would be required to have a minimum amount of money, usually a larger balance than you would in a regular checking or savings. And the bank would give you a higher rate of return as a result. And one of the upsides is that it's still FDIC insured. You still have access to it. It's still liquid. It's still safe. And typically you would have a higher rate of return than you would. But because of the current interest rate environment, I have not seen a lot of money market accounts out there that are really paying that much more, if any, than a high yield savings account. So having to have a larger balance and you're not really getting that much more, sometimes it might not even make sense to switch from a high yield savings to a money market account. Now, I don't want you to confuse the money market account with a money market fund, because there are money market funds for those of you that invest. If you have a brokerage account, you might see an option to have money market fund within that account. And that traditionally serves as an alternative to cash, where you would have a certain amount of cash in your account, but I wouldn't recommend that you necessarily have your emergency savings in your money market fund within a brokerage account, because a money market fund is not really FDIC insured. And although this does not happen often, you could lose some money in your money market fund. So keep that in mind. That's usually a better place for you to just have cash in hand in your brokerage account to take advantage of opportunities later, like purchasing stocks and things like that within the account. So when you have your emergency savings, it's something that you want to have available in case of an emergency, right? But you want to make sure that you have access, it's safe, and you're not chasing interest rates, right? So I just wanted to reiterate that interest rate should be like the third thing that you look at. And then I also get questions from people that say, well, what about like things like bonds, short-term bonds, treasuries, things of that sort? Any of those things that are considered quote unquote safe are still subject to fluctuation in value. So I wouldn't advise that you put your emergency savings into bond funds, because you still could lose money. And the whole purpose of the emergency saving is not to lose the money and maybe make a little interest, right? So think about what the goal is, how accessible you want it, because some people happen to have extra cash for maybe intermediate or longer term goals. Like you might have money set aside for a down payment on a home, but you're not ready to purchase yet. You might not want to invest that either, because you probably will be buying a house within the next year, for example. but you don't want it to just sit in your checking either. You want to make some interest. So maybe a high yield savings account, perhaps a money market account. Just compare the two and see which one's better for you. Now, there's another option, especially if you have intermediate or longer term goals, that you have money that you don't necessarily need access to it all at once. If an emergency happens, you're probably not going to need your entire emergency savings all at once. Especially if you have, say, 6 months worth of expenses, you're probably not going to need it all in one shot. So one thing that you could do is look into CDs, which are certificates of deposit. CDs are another good option because they typically would give you a higher interest rate of return. And, I keep coming back to that. This is not a normal environment because rates are so low. There are CDs out there that are still not even as attractive as high yield savings. And the downside to the CD is that you're locking in your money for a period of time. You do have access to it, usually not via an ATM. You have to go to the bank, et cetera. But if you do take it out before the maturity, you're going to pay a penalty. So you buy CDs based on a given time. There are 3-month CDs, 6-month CDs, 9 months, 12 months. I've seen them as seen a 5-year CD as well, and at a credit union. So you lock in your money for a period of time. So because you're giving the bank your money and locking it for a period of time, you don't have access to it like you would on a savings account. And if you do, you're going to pay a penalty. The bank in turn will typically pay you a higher rate of return. So what a lot of people do, it's a good strategy to do, is that you can basically ladder your CDs. And what I mean by that is you can buy several different ones so that you can have access in a short period of time each time. So for example, you can break it up and buy 4 or 5 CDs, 1 3 months, 1 6 months, 1 9 months. So every so often, you're basically going to have one of those CDs maturing, which you can then either put it back into a CD or just put it back into your savings, et cetera, depending on how long your goal is. So if you have a goal like buying a house in 2 years and you have a significant amount of money for your down payment, but you don't want to invest it and take any risk, you could put it in CD, maybe ladder it, buy a couple of short-term CDs with different maturity dates so that you always have enough money in case of an emergency without having to take money before the maturity date. But again, when I look at the CD rates out there, they're really not that much more attractive. In fact, sometimes I've seen them even lower than high yield savings. So it doesn't make sense to lock your money up if you're not even being compensated, right? So something else to consider. And one more thing I wanted to mention was there's another account that is making waves. Is a high yield checking account. I've seen some online lenders out there offering checking accounts where you can now get a much higher rate of return than you would on a high yield savings. Now, there are some things that you need to follow, like they might require that you have direct deposit for a certain amount every month. They might require a certain amount of transactions per month. And they might have a max as well as far as the amount of money that you can put. But it could be an alternative or part of your overall plan. If you have a significant amount in emergency savings or money that you might not need until intermediate goal, you might want to put some of that into a high yield checking and just make sure that if it fits your lifestyle in terms of having the direct deposit go there and having the minimum amount of transactions that are required, it might make sense. It might be too much of a hassle for some, having to switch banks or get an additional bank account, but it's something else to look into. So wrapping up, I just wanted to reiterate, when you are looking at your emergency savings, the main 2 things you want to look at is it safe where I'm putting this money? And is it liquid? Is it accessible? The third thing that you want to look at then is interest rates. Yes, inflation happens and prices go up over time. So if you're not earning a rate of return that is as high as inflation, plus whatever little interest you're getting, you also have to pay income taxes on that money. So over time, yes, you might be actually losing money because you have to look at the real rate of return on that money. But because you're expecting to use it relatively quickly, it's not something that you want to take chances with and try to invest it to make a higher interest rate of return. Because with that investment, if you decided to put it in stocks or something like that, you might get a higher rate of return, but you might also lose your actual principal and not have it accessible or fully accessible. You might have to sell it at a loss when you need the funds the most, and that's pretty bad combination, right? The moment you have an emergency and your stocks are down, and now you have to sell low and then take a loss and take whatever money you can access. So you definitely don't want to do that. So just keep that in mind. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email, luis@onmywaytowealth.com. If you have any ideas for the show or anybody that you'd like for me to interview and you want to make an introduction, I'm always open to opportunities. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you for listening to On My Way to Wealth. If you have any questions, please send me an email at luis@onmywaytowealth.com. The information provided here is for information and education purposes only. The opinions expressed herein are solely those of myself, unless otherwise specifically cited. Material presented is believed to be from reliable sources, and no representations are made by my firm or myself about other parties' information or accuracy or completeness. All information or ideas provided should be discussed in detail with a financial advisor, accountant, or legal counsel prior to implementation. Thank you.